I've never been the type of person who believed in the supernatural. Growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, I'd always heard stories about the local cemetery, how strange lights were seen at night, how people claimed to hear whispers when no one was there, and how some teenagers who dared to sneak in after midnight swore they felt watched. To me, all of that was just folklore, kids trying to scare one another, or adults exaggerating to keep us out of trouble. I never thought I'd find myself in a position where I'd question everything I believed. But then came the night that changed my life forever. It was late October, one of those chilly autumn evenings when the air has that sharp bite that cuts through your jacket. I was 23 at the time, fresh out of college and back in town visiting my parents for the weekend. A couple of old friends from high school invited me to hang out, and, fueled by beer and nostalgia, the night ended with us daring each other to sneak into the graveyard just outside town, the one we'd been warned about since childhood. I wasn't drunk, but I was buzzed enough to think it would be funny to finally put those old legends to rest. There were 4 of us: me, Tyler, Josh, and Hannah. We parked Tyler's beat-up Chevy by the side of the road and hopped the low stone wall that circled the graveyard. The place looked exactly as it had when I was a kid. Rows of crooked headstones leaning like tired soldiers, patches of unkempt grass, and a set of giant oak trees whose branches hung low enough to scrape your shoulders if you weren't careful. The sky was moonless, which meant the graveyard was swallowed in shadows. I had to use my phone flashlight just to see the ground. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. You don't notice it at first, but cemeteries have this strange stillness to them, like the air itself is holding its breath. We joked around at first, laughing too loudly, trying to cover up how uneasy we actually felt. Josh, who always had a cruel streak, suggested we play a game. Each of us had to split off, walk to the farthest corner of the graveyard, and touch the oldest headstone we could find. Whoever chickened out first would have to buy breakfast in the morning. Reluctantly, we agreed. That's when the night stopped feeling like a harmless dare. I walked alone, my light bobbing over names etched into weathered stone. Some were from the 1800s, their inscriptions nearly worn away by time. As I moved deeper, the air grew colder, and the crunch of leaves beneath my shoes seemed deafening in the silence. I remember thinking how strange it was that no insects chirped, no owls hooted, just the sound of my own breathing. And then I saw it, a headstone unlike the others, much larger, made of black granite, its surface strangely clean compared to the moss-covered markers around it. The inscription was simple: Elizabeth Crane, 1821-1844. She waits. That last part, she waits, made my stomach twist. I thought maybe it was some poetic phrase or a family motto, but something about the words felt wrong, like it wasn't meant for the living to read. I reached out, intending to brush my hand against it and be done. But the second my fingers touched the cold stone, a noise cut through the silence. A faint whisper, so soft I couldn't make out the words. My first instinct was that one of my friends was screwing with me, but when I spun around, my light revealed nothing but endless rows of graves. That's when I saw the shadow. It wasn't cast by my flashlight. It moved against it. A tall, thin figure gliding between the headstones, just at the edge of my vision. My pulse spiked. I called out, thinking it had to be Tyler or Josh, but no one answered. Instead, the whisper returned, clearer this time, though still distorted by the wind. It said my name. I don't know how to describe the feeling of hearing your own name spoken in a place like that. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like it pressed against my chest from the inside. I stumbled back, my light shaking as it swept across the graves. That's when I realized something even more terrifying. Every headstone I passed on the way in, the names had changed. Where once there had been James Carter or Anna Whitmore, now every single stone bore my last name. Mahoney, Mahoney, Mahoney. Over and over, etched in stone. My hands went numb. I backed up, tripping over a root, and when I hit the ground, the air suddenly filled with the sound of crying. Not loud sobs, soft, pained weeping coming from all around me, from beneath the ground. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care about the game anymore. I didn't care about breakfast or dares. I just wanted out. But no matter which way I turned, the rows of graves stretched endlessly, the wall nowhere in sight. It was as if the graveyard had grown, reshaping itself to keep me inside. And then, I saw her. A woman standing beneath one of the oaks. Her dress was from another century, torn and stained, her skin pale as candle wax. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt frozen, like my body didn't belong to me anymore. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed, not at me, but at the stone I'd touched. Elizabeth Crane's grave. The whispers rose into a chorus, hundreds of voices overlapping, all murmuring the same phrase over and over. She waits. She waits. She waits. And in that moment, I understood. Elizabeth Crane wasn't just buried there. She was still there, waiting, not for peace, not for God, but for someone like me. Someone stupid enough to touch her stone and wake her up. My vision blurred, the ground tilted, and the last thing I remember before blacking out was her face, stretched into a smile that looked more like a wound than an expression. When I woke, it was morning. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and I was lying just outside the cemetery wall, dirt under my nails and blood on my palms like I'd clawed my way out. My friends were gone. Tyler's truck was gone. My phone too. I stumbled home in a daze, trying to piece it all together. My parents were furious, saying Tyler had dropped me off hours earlier and told them I'd been acting weird, like I was in shock. They hadn't seen Hannah or Josh either. No one has. Not to this day. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night, years later. A week after that night, I returned to the graveyard in broad daylight, determined to prove to myself that it was all some drunken hallucination. I found Elizabeth Crane's stone easily. It was still black, still spotless, still inscribed with those chilling words. But when I leaned closer, my blood ran cold. Beneath her name, a new line had been carved into the granite. And so does he. And under that was my name. People don't like to talk about what happened in my hometown back in 2015. It's one of those things that gets passed around in whispers, half-truths mixed with rumor, until no one's sure where the story ends and the legend begins. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And no matter how much I've tried to move on, I can't escape it. Every night when I close my eyes, I still hear the sound, that awful sound of shovels in the dirt when no one's supposed to be digging. I grew up in Vermont in a small town tucked between rolling hills and endless stretches of forest. We had one graveyard, old, neglected, and mostly forgotten. It wasn't the kind of place people visited. Families moved away, lines died out, and the graves just sat there untended like scars in the earth. When I was 19, I took a part-time job with the local groundskeeping service. Most of the work was mowing, cleaning up branches after storms, and hauling trash. One day, my boss told me we'd gotten a special request. A wealthy family had recently purchased land just outside town, and they wanted their ancestors' graves exhumed from the old cemetery and moved to a new family plot they'd built on their estate. It sounded weird, but money was money. So there I was, late one Friday evening, standing in the middle of that overgrown graveyard with two other guys from the crew. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple, and the shadows stretched long over the crooked stones. Our boss had given us strict instructions. Start the digging tonight, finish tomorrow, and get it done quietly. He didn't want rumors spreading about us moving bodies. I remember the first grave we worked on. The stone was barely legible, the date from 1873. We set up floodlights, fired up the generator, and got to work. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. It felt wrong, disturbing the ground like that, but none of us said anything. We just kept digging, our shovels clanking against rocks, the soil cold and heavy. It wasn't long before we hit the coffin. The wood was soft, falling apart as soon as we touched it. Inside were just bones, fragile and yellowed with age. We transferred them into a bag, sealed it, and set it aside. I tried not to think about how someone's entire life had been reduced to a sack of brittle fragments, but it was the second grave that changed everything. The stone was different, black, polished, and surprisingly well preserved. The name read, Nathaniel Crowe, 1819-1881. As soon as we started digging, I noticed the soil was different. It was darker, almost black, and damp in a way that didn't make sense. It clung to the shovel, heavy and sticky, as if it didn't want to be moved. The deeper we dug, the worse the smell became, not just earth and rot, but something sharp, metallic, like iron. When the shovel hit the coffin, it didn't splinter like the first one. It rang. Hollow, metallic. Confused, we cleared the dirt away, and what we uncovered didn't look like any coffin I'd ever seen. It was iron, sealed tight, with strange markings etched into the lid, symbols I couldn't recognize. We exchanged uneasy looks. One of the guys, Mark, joked that it looked like a vampire's coffin. Nobody laughed. We should have stopped right there. We should have covered it back up and walked away. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and our boss was expecting results. So we pried it open. The lid groaned as the bolts gave way, and the moment the seal broke, a gust of air rushed out, stale, cold, and reeking of something sour. Inside wasn't just a skeleton. It was a body, perfectly preserved, like the man had only just died. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, his black suit immaculate despite the century that had passed. His eyes were closed, but I swear to God, I could see movement beneath the lids. We staggered back, gagging from the smell, but something held us there. A presence heavy and suffocating, pressing down like the air itself had thickened. Mark muttered that we needed to close it, but before we could, the generator cut out. The floodlights blinked off, plunging us into darkness. And that's when we heard it. The sound of breathing. Not ours, something else. Slow, deliberate inhales and exhales coming from the coffin. I fumbled for my flashlight, but the batteries flickered weakly, barely piercing the dark. In that thin beam, I saw his eyes. They were open now. Pale, cloudy, but alive. Staring right at me. I froze. My body refused to move. Then his lips parted, dry and cracked, and a low whisper escaped. "Bury me back." The words slithered into my ears, oily and cold. Mark screamed, dropped his shovel, and bolted into the trees. The other guy, Danny, stumbled backward, tripped over a stone, and fell hard. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. Those eyes held me in place like chains. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled. Not like an earthquake, more like something shifting beneath the soil, stretching, cracking. Around us, other graves began to stir. Dirt shifted, stones rattled, and faint, muffled sounds echoed up from the earth. Knocking, scratching, begging. Danny scrambled to his feet and grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it. We ran, leaving everything, the tools, the lights, even the open coffin behind. Mark was nowhere in sight. We didn't stop until we were back on the road, gasping for breath, our clothes smeared with dirt. When we returned with the boss the next morning, the site looked normal. The coffin was gone, the hole filled as if we'd never dug it. The ground was smooth, untouched, but Mark never came back. His family reported him missing. The police searched the area, found no trace. Danny and I told them he must have run off, but we knew better. We just couldn't prove it. That night, I dreamed of Nathaniel Crowe. He stood at the foot of my bed, dirt dripping from his suit, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He leaned down, close enough that I could smell the sour stench of the coffin, and whispered the same words again. "Bury me back." I woke drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me. The next day, Danny called me in a panic. He'd heard the same voice, the same words whispered through his bedroom window even though he lived on the second floor. For weeks, we lived in terror. Every night, the voice came. Sometimes from outside the door, sometimes from the closet, sometimes from right beside my bed. Bury me back, bury me back. Danny couldn't take it. One night, he went back to the graveyard alone. His mother found his truck parked by the stone wall the next morning, but no sign of him. Just footprints leading into the cemetery, and none coming out. I left town soon after. I thought maybe if I put enough distance between myself and that graveyard, it would stop. For a while, it did. I built a new life, got a new job, tried to forget. But 2 months ago, on a perfectly ordinary night in my new apartment hundreds of miles away, I woke to the sound of shovels. That scraping, digging sound coming from the corner of my room. When I turned on the light, the carpet was torn, soil scattered across the floorboards, fresh and black. And written in that soil, with long, deliberate strokes, were the words, "You didn't bury me back." When I was younger, I used to romanticize the idea of working nights. Something about being awake while the world slept made me feel different, almost important. That's why when I landed a security job at St. Mary's Cemetery on the outskirts of Hartford, Connecticut, I thought I'd struck gold. A quiet paycheck for doing almost nothing. Just strolling through headstones with a flashlight, making sure teenagers weren't sneaking in to drink or vandalize. Easy work. But the truth is, the night doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the things that thrive when the rest of the world isn't looking. I learned that the hard way. St. Mary's was old, sprawling across acres of land, with graves dating back to the Civil War. During the day it looked peaceful, almost beautiful, with rows of marble stones and well-tended lawns. But at night, it was a different world. The trees bent low like skeletal arms, the shadows stretched unnaturally, and the silence had a depth that pressed against your ears. My shifts started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The first week was uneventful. I'd make rounds every hour, radio in if I saw anything suspicious, and kill time scrolling on my phone. The strangest thing I encountered was a raccoon knocking over a trash can. But on my second week, something changed. It was a Wednesday night, clear skies, the moon bright enough to paint the headstones silver. Around midnight, I was making my rounds near the farthest section of the cemetery, where the oldest graves were. That's when I noticed something unusual. One of the mausoleum doors was slightly open. Now, these mausoleums were old stone structures sealed shut decades ago. No one went in, no one came out. The door being open made no sense. I radioed it in, but static hissed back, my voice swallowed by white noise. Annoyed, I decided to check it myself. I pushed the heavy iron door and it groaned loudly, the sound echoing like a scream in the quiet night. Inside, my flashlight beam revealed rows of stone crypts, dust thick on the floor, spider webs hanging like curtains. But one of the crypts stood out. Its slab was shifted just enough to leave a gap. I told myself it was vandals, probably kids trying to freak each other out. But when I leaned closer, I noticed something that froze my blood. The dust on the floor wasn't undisturbed like the rest of the mausoleum. It was smeared, streaked, as if something had been dragged out. That was the first night I heard the singing. At first it was so faint I thought it was the wind, a soft lilting tune like a lullaby. It floated through the mausoleum, echoing off the stone, seeping into my ears. I backed out quickly, shut the door, and told myself I'd report it in the morning. But as I walked away, the tune followed me, growing louder, sweeter, like it wanted me to listen. The next night, it happened again. This time, the singing came not just from the mausoleum, but from different corners of the graveyard, weaving through the air like invisible threads. I couldn't tell if it was one voice or many, but it was always the same tune, soft, haunting, almost comforting. Almost. I tried to ignore it, but by the third night, it became impossible. The singing grew clearer, and with it came words. I couldn't understand them at first. strange syllables that rolled like whispers. But eventually, I began to recognize fragments. My name, spoken softly, hidden in the melody. That's when I started to lose sleep. Even when I went home in the morning, exhausted, I'd hear the tune faintly in the hum of my fridge, the buzz of the street outside. It followed me, like a shadow. I told my supervisor, but he laughed it off. Said I'd been spending too much time alone, letting my imagination run wild. But I knew what I heard. I knew it was real. On the fourth night, I decided to record it. I brought a small digital recorder, turned it on, and left it in my pocket while I made rounds. Sure enough, the singing began around midnight. Clear, sweet, unmistakable. I felt both terrified and relieved. Finally, proof. But when I played it back the next morning, there was nothing. Just silence. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with something normal. By the fifth night, the singing no longer stayed at a distance. It was close now, right behind me, as I walked the rows of graves. I'd spin around, flashlight cutting through the dark, but there was never anyone there. Yet the air would be warm, like someone had just breathed against my neck. I stopped making full rounds. I stayed near the office, lights on, doors locked, praying for the dawn. But even inside, the singing seeped through the walls, curling around me like smoke. And then came the dreams. I'd fall asleep at home and find myself back in the cemetery, always the same spot, standing before the mausoleum with the shifted crypt. The door would swing open on its own, the lullaby spilling out like perfume. And I'd see her, a woman in a long white dress, her hair black and tangled, her face pale as marble. She never spoke, never moved, just stood in the shadows of the mausoleum singing that awful song. But her eyes were always on me. I started avoiding sleep altogether. Coffee, energy drinks, anything to keep me awake. My body was breaking down, but I couldn't face her again. The final night of my job, I didn't even mean to fall asleep. I was in the office, head on the desk, and the next thing I knew, I was standing in the cemetery again, dreaming. Except it didn't feel like a dream this time. The cold bit into my skin. The grass was damp under my shoes, and the air reeked of soil and stone. The singing was louder than ever, drawing me to the mausoleum. I fought it, tried to turn away, but my legs moved on their own, dragging me forward like I was a puppet on strings. The door creaked open, and there she was. But this time, she stepped out. Her dress dragged along the ground, stained with dirt. Her face was cracked like porcelain, and from those cracks, black soil spilled as if she wasn't filled with flesh and blood, but earth itself. She reached out a hand, her fingers long, sharp, and caked with dirt. "Stay," she whispered. Not sung, whispered. And the moment the word left her lips, every grave in the cemetery groaned. The ground shifted, and from the soil, hands began to push up. Dozens of them, pale and broken, clawing their way out. I ran. I don't remember how or where. I only remember waking up on my apartment floor the next morning, mud smeared across my carpet, dirt under my fingernails. I quit the job immediately, packed up, and left Hartford. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just nightmares bleeding into reality. I almost believed it. Until last week. I was driving late at night through a different town, miles away from Connecticut. The radio was on low, just static between stations. And through that static, I heard it. The lullaby. Soft. Sweet. My name woven into the tune. And in the rearview mirror, for just a second, I saw her, sitting in the back seat, pale face cracked, soil spilling from her smile. There are some jobs you take because you need the money, and there are others you take because you don't know any better. I took mine out of desperation. Rent was overdue, bills stacked on the counter, and my car was one bad noise away from the junkyard. So when I saw a Craigslist ad looking for overnight caretakers at a cemetery outside of Cleveland, I didn't think twice. The pay was decent, and the ad made it sound simple. Keep watch, report trespassers, lock up the gates at dawn, easy money. The place was called Green Hollow Cemetery, and from the moment I saw it, something about it felt wrong. It wasn't the graves themselves. Every cemetery looks eerie if you stare too long. It was the layout. The headstones weren't lined up neatly but scattered, crooked, like they'd been dropped carelessly. The ground dipped in strange angles, as though it was sinking in places. And the air smelled like rusted iron, even on clear nights. My first night there, the manager, an older guy named Harris, gave me a quick tour. He seemed jittery, glancing over his shoulder as though he couldn't wait to leave. "You don't need to do much," he said. "Just make rounds every couple hours, make sure the lights are on, don't let anyone wander in, and don't go near the north section." I laughed, thinking he was joking. He didn't laugh back. When I asked why, he muttered something about the ground being unstable, unsafe, but the way his eyes darted away told me there was more to it. That first shift was uneventful. I walked the paths, sipped my coffee, killed time scrolling on my phone. But around 2 a.m. I noticed something strange. From the north section, the very place Harris told me to avoid, I saw movement. A figure, pale and thin, drifting between the stones. I froze. It wasn't unusual for drunk kids to sneak in, but this wasn't that. Whoever it was moved too slowly, too smoothly, like they weren't walking but gliding. My flashlight beam cut across the rows of graves, but the figure slipped away before I could get a clear look. That night I didn't go near the north section, but the next morning curiosity gnawed at me. So after my shift, instead of heading straight home, I walked back in daylight. The north section looked different from the rest of the cemetery. The grass was brittle, yellow, dead in patches. The headstones were older, their names almost erased by weather. In the center stood a single massive tree, gnarled, blackened, its branches bare even in spring. At its base was a stone unlike any I'd ever seen. Not a normal headstone, but a slab, flat and wide, covered in symbols I couldn't read. It looked ancient, older than the cemetery itself. The air around it was colder, sharper, like standing in the shade even under the sun. Something about it unsettled me so badly I left without touching it. But that night, things began to change. Around midnight, while making my rounds, I heard it. A low hum, almost like chanting. It came from the north section. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to stay away, but the sound grew louder, pulling me toward it. Against my better judgment, I followed. When I reached the tree, the chanting stopped. The night was dead silent, too silent as if the world had been muted. And then I saw it. The slab was glowing faintly, a sickly green light seeping from the cracks in the stone. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, until a voice snapped me out of it. Not a human voice, but something deep, layered, as though multiple people were speaking at once. "Stay away." The words echoed in my chest more than in my ears. My flashlight flickered violently before dying completely, plunging me into darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw shapes rising from the ground, long, twisted shadows reaching for me. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping until I was back in the office with the door locked tight. I didn't tell Harris. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light, stress. But the next night, the same thing happened. And the night after that. The chanting, the glow, the voice. Always pulling me back to that slab, like it wanted me to see more. On the fourth night, I caved. I approached the slab, flashlight trembling in my hand. The glow was stronger now, spilling across the grass like liquid. And carved into the stone beneath the symbols was a name. My name. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. That's impossible, I thought. Some sick prank, maybe? But no. Those letters were etched deep, weathered by time, as though they'd been there long before I was born. That night, the dreams began. I'd find myself lying on that slab, the tree's bare branches curling above me like claws. Dozens of figures stood around the stone, their faces hidden, chanting in that low, guttural hum. And always, at the end of the dream, the ground would split open, and hands, rotting, skeletal hands, would claw their way out, reaching for me. I stopped sleeping. Coffee and energy drinks kept me going, but the hallucinations crept in. I'd see faces in the headstones, eyes in the shadows, lips moving silently in the dark. By the 6th night, I'd had enough. I told Harris I was quitting, effective immediately. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded and said, "You lasted longer than most." But leaving didn't save me. 2 weeks after I quit, I woke in the middle of the night to find dirt on my bedroom floor. My shoes caked in mud, though I hadn't been outside. And in the corner of my room, carved deep into the plaster, was the same name, the one on the slab. Mine. I moved, packed everything, left Cleveland behind. I thought I could outrun it. But last night, while driving home from work in a completely different state, I passed a small graveyard. Out of the corner of my eye, through the trees, I saw it. The same gnarled tree, the same cracked slab glowing faintly beneath it. And I swear, I could hear the chanting again. This time it was louder. This time, it was calling me closer. I grew up in a small New England town, the kind of place where every street had its history and every family seemed to carry generations of secrets. About 3 miles outside of town, hidden behind a curtain of overgrown pine trees and thorny brush, sat a graveyard most people didn't even know existed. It wasn't listed on the town's records, nor was it maintained by the church. The locals called it Whispering Pines Cemetery, though no one could tell me where the name came from. The place was old, the tombstones leaning and cracked, some swallowed by roots and vines. When I was younger, I always assumed the graveyard was just abandoned land. One of those forgotten places people leave behind when towns expand and generations move on. But by the time I turned 25, I learned that some things aren't forgotten at all. They wait, patiently. My first encounter with Whispering Pines wasn't intentional. I had taken a wrong turn one autumn evening while driving home after a late shift at the diner. My GPS signal had cut out, and before I realized it, I was on a dirt road flanked by looming pine trees. When my headlights swept across a clearing, I caught sight of weathered stone crosses and crooked headstones. For some reason, instead of turning back, I pulled over. The air outside felt unnaturally still, as though the forest itself held its breath. The silence was heavy, pressing down on me until even the sound of my own footsteps felt too loud. The only movement came from the wind, teasing the tops of the pines, which created an eerie, whisper-like murmur. That's when I noticed something strange. Amid the tangle of weeds and moss-covered markers, there was a fresh bouquet of flowers, laid carefully on one of the graves. Someone was taking care of this place. I left quickly that night, unsettled but curious. Over the next week, I found my mind drifting back to the cemetery, like a splinter beneath the skin. Against my better judgment, I went back the following Saturday, this time in daylight. The graves were even older than I'd thought. Most inscriptions had been erased by weather, some dating back to the 1700s. Yet the same grave had fresh flowers. They were different this time, daisies instead of roses, but still vibrant, as if someone had placed them there that very morning. That was the first time I met him. He appeared suddenly, a tall man in a dark overcoat and wide-brimmed hat, stepping from the shade of the trees as though he had been watching me all along. His face was pale, almost waxy, his features sharp. His eyes, however, were the kind that pinned you where you stood, unblinking, gray, and cold. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying an authority that made my stomach twist. I stammered some excuse about curiosity, but he cut me off. "These grounds are not for the living. Go home, and don't return." But I did return, again and again. Something about the place, and about him, pulled at me. I began noticing things I had missed before. The way no leaves ever seemed to settle on the graves, the faint smell of candle wax lingering in the air, and the distant sound of whispering voices that grew louder the longer I stayed. One evening, determined to learn more, I lingered after dusk. The man emerged from the shadows again, but this time he didn't order me to leave. Instead, he asked me a question. "Do you believe the dead can remember?" I didn't know how to answer. He smiled faintly, though it wasn't a kind smile. "They do. They remember everything." Then he walked past me, kneeling at the same grave where the flowers always appeared. He whispered something I couldn't hear, and I swear, though I will never be able to prove it, that the soil moved. Just slightly. I should have run. I should have never gone back. But obsession has a way of taking hold. I began researching whispering pines, scouring old newspapers, town archives, anything I could find. What I uncovered made no sense. According to town records, the land had been unused since the late 1800s. There were no burial permits, no mention of a cemetery at all. And yet, headstones stood, bodies lay beneath them, and someone was tending to them. Weeks turned into months, and my visits grew longer. The man, who eventually introduced himself only as the keeper, began speaking to me in fragments, riddles I couldn't quite piece together. Every soul deserves remembrance. A name unspoken is a life erased. To forget is to kill twice. The last time I saw him, winter had just begun, and the cemetery was cloaked in snow. The keeper was waiting for me, standing beside the same grave as always, but this time there were no flowers. Instead, there was an empty space where a stone had been removed. A gaping, freshly dug hole. He looked at me with those gray eyes and said, "It's your turn." At first I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but he stepped aside, and I saw what was carved into the newly unearthed headstone leaning against a tree. My name, my full name, my date of birth, and a death date, today. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, demanding answers, but the keeper only repeated the same words. "The dead remember. They've chosen you." I don't remember how I escaped. I just remember running, tripping over roots and tearing through the pines until I reached the road. When I turned back, the cemetery was gone. Not hidden. Gone. Nothing but trees and untouched snow. I tried returning later, in daylight. But no matter how far I drove along that dirt road, Whispering Pines Cemetery was nowhere to be found. And yet, every year since that night, on the anniversary of the date carved into that stone, I find fresh flowers at my doorstep. Always the same kind the keeper used to place, always tied with the same black ribbon. I don't know when they'll finally dig my grave, but I know this. When they do, the keeper will be waiting.